Okay guys, so welcome back again. So in this video, let's have a look at the data fetching library called SWR. And basically this library is my go-to library for any of my React or Next.js projects. So this library provides us with a hook called use SWR, and then we can use that hook to make API calls to our resource server. So for the purposes of this video, I would be using this JSON placeholder API, which provides us with resources here. If we scroll down, we can see that if we go to this URL that is /users, we would get back a list of 10 users. So that's what we are going to use inside this video. And if we have a look at one more thing, that is, let me copy this URL and let me paste it here. And if we simply append one here, we see that we then get back a single user object here. So this is the fake REST API which we are going to use inside our application as of now to demonstrate how use SWR works. So without wasting any time, let's jump into our code. And the first thing we need to do before jumping into code, we need to see that how do we install this library. So for that, we can simply go to docs here. So if you are using yarn, you can simply do yarn and swr, or if you are using npm, then you can simply use npm install swr. So let's go to our VS Code here. And here what I've done is that I've created a very basic React project using create React app package, which simply provides us with this skeleton here for a React project. And currently I've stripped down the app component here, and it currently displays data fetching using use SWR hook, as we can see here on the right side. And now if we go to the package.json file, we see that here we have the dependencies here. But for this project, I've installed two more dependencies. That is the SWR library itself by doing npm i swr. And it is super simple to do. And then I've installed one more dependency that is not exactly needed by SWR, but that is again my go-to dependency whenever I'm using the SWR library. So I've also installed this library called Axios. Though you can use the browser built-in fetch API, you can use that fetch API, but I always go for Axios because for me it's like bread and butter for any React or Next.js application, or for kind of any web application. It's my go-to library again. So we would be using SWR with Axios, and you would be getting to know that why do we need Axios here, in case you were not using the fetch API. So let me close the package.json file. And the first thing we need to do, instead of doing anything inside this app component, what I would like to do, I would like to create a new component inside my source folder here, which would be containing the data that is coming from that user's endpoint. So why not let me simply create a new file, and here let me simply call it users component.jsx. Though you can call it JS or JSX, whatever you feel like, but for me it's better to call it JSX. And now what I'll do, I'll simply create a functional component here called user component, and it would simply have an h1 here, and that should simply say user component like this. And now let me import this user component inside my app.js file, and you would be getting to know that why I've created this separate component here in a moment. So user component like this, and this is automatically imported here from users component. So let's save this and let's run this application if it is not started here. So we do not see that users component here, or we do see that users component here. So we are seeing that user component here. So why not let's take this user component out from this app header, so that it is somewhere here. And now let's go to our user component, and all the magic happens in this component. So firstly, what we need to have is that from that SWR library, we need to import one hook, and that is the use SWR hook. So what we'll say, import use SWR from SWR. And now we would be using this hook to fetch data from that URL. So firstly, let's go to that URL to get the URL endpoint. So let's simply copy this inside our clipboard. And now here, what I need to do, I need to use the use SWR hook, which we just imported. So what I'll say const something equal to use SWR. And now basically this hook returns us a couple of values here inside this object, which we would be seeing in a moment. But firstly, this use SWR hook accepts at least two parameters, or in some cases even a single parameter. But here the first parameter you need to provide here is the key, and in our case the key would be the URL endpoint from which you want to get data from. So I just copied the URL endpoint, and that is this endpoint, to get the data from. And then it expects a second argument, and that is called a fetcher function. So fetcher, like this. And now what this fetcher function does, it simply returns the data that is associated with this URL endpoint. So let's create this fetcher function somewhere outside this component here. So let's create that fetcher function here. So const fetcher equal to an arrow function like this, and this should return some kind of a data, and that data would be provided by this use SWR library inside the data object here like this, simply like this. So how do we get this data here, that is from this fetcher function? So to do that, what we need to do, we need to pass some kind of a URL inside this fetcher function. And now that is the magic of this use SWR hook. That is, whatever URL or key you provide here would be automatically passed to this fetcher function. So here we can simply say that this is a URL that is passed here. And how to get data? So to get data, what we are going to use, we are going to import Axios from Axios. So that's why I said that I'm using Axios here, though you could have used the fetch API also. And here what we can simply say, axios.get, we can pass in the URL, and then we have a response. So response like this, and then we can simply return response.data. And now this response.data would be available inside this data parameter here, inside this object here, which is returned by use SWR hook. And in case if this request fails, that is, in case if this request throws some error, then we do not need to manually handle the error always, like using the catch block. But if you want to do some more stuff with this with the error handling, then you can definitely handle the catch stuff. But by default, if this request throws us an error, then this use SWR hook would also automatically handle that, and that would be provided in the error object here. That is, if there is an error to get this URL, then it would be present inside this error object, which is provided by this use SWR hook. So that's all what you need to do to get data or error from this use SWR hook. And now how do we know that whether we have our data, whether we have an error, or whether we are currently in the process of making a request, that is, whether we are in a loading state? So to do that, it is very simple again. Firstly, we need to check if there is an error. So we'll check if error. If there is an error, then what we need to do, we need to simply spit out the error here, and here we can simply say error.message like this. And now if there is not an error, then there might be a case that we are currently in the process of making a request and we are in a loading state. We neither have data here, we neither have an error. Then what we can do, we can simply make an if check again, that is if not data. That is, if there is not a data, if there is no data, and if there is no error, then what we can do, we can simply say we are in a process of loading here. So here what you can do, you can simply show in a skeleton or something like that. But here I'm simply outputting loading here inside the p tags. And now finally, if there is no error and this is also false, then we are finally here, which means that we do have data. So to display data, what I'm going to do, I'm simply going to use tree tags to display the JSON output here. So we can say json.stringify data, null, 2, just to make a beautiful output here. And now as soon as we save this application, you see that on the right side, we should be getting the array of user objects here inside this user component. So let me save this application. And we see that we have this data that is coming from the JSON placeholder API. And now if I reload the page, you might be seeing a flash of loading message. And this should not be like this. This should be like, it should be like a return. It should be like a return this thing here. And the same thing goes for this thing again. That is, it should be return like this and not directly p tags like as it was before. And now if I reload the application once again, we should be getting a flash of loading here. So we see that we got loading that is flashing here. Or instead, let me put it in H1 here so that we can see it more clearly. So as soon as I do it, we are not able to see it. So what I'll do, I'll simply go to inspect and I'll simply reduce my network speed so that we can see the loading state here. So let me go here, that is throttling, and let me go to slow 3G. And now as soon as I reload, we should be getting a loading state here. So we would be seeing that. So we see we are get in a loading state, and now finally when there was no error and we have the data, we see this data object here. So now let's see that how do we see the error. So for that it is pretty simple to do. Let me simply change this URL which doesn't exist, and it should throw us a 404. So let me save this, and here as soon as I reload the page, we should be getting error here, that is 404 not found. So we see that we are getting this message, that is request failed with status code 404, because this route does not exist. So this is the most simple way of fetching data using the use SWR hook. Now let's have a look at some more things which you can pass to this use SWR hook. So currently, if we go to this library page here, and if we have a look at the options here, the third parameter inside this SWR hook, which we can pass, is an object of options here. And options, there are so many options which you can pass here, but I would simply go through a couple of them because they might be useful to you. So let's go back here. So let's go back to our application, and here what we can do, we can pass in a third option here, or a third parameter here containing the options object. So currently watch what happens here. So let me open another tab here. So let me simply open another tab here, and let me open the window here, that is inspect, and let me go to the network tab here, and let me reload the page. Let me clear out the console, and now you see that we are inside this user component. So if I simply change the window here to some other window inside my browser, and as soon as I switch back to this React application or to our application where we are using this SWR hook, we would be seeing that a call is made again to the endpoint to revalidate the data. As we can see, now we have these two users here. So let me delete it once again, and now let me switch back to another window, and as soon as I switch back to this React app window, we see that we are again revalidating the data as soon as this window is in focus. So this is one of the most interesting parts, or one of the most required parts for any application, that refetches the data as soon as the window is in focus. Though you can disable this behavior also by simply putting in an option here, that is revalidate on focus to be false. By default it is true, but if you simply pass and revalidate on focus to be false, then you would not be revalidating your data whenever this window is in focus again. So let me save this, and let me clear out the this thing here, network request, and let me switch another window. Let's go back to our main window again. Now we see that since this revalidate on focus is false, so we do not make another network request. So this is something you might use or you might not use. So now let's have a look at another option here, and that is refresh interval. So let me write it first. So let the refresh interval be 1000 milliseconds. That is, this value should be in milliseconds. So it is 1 second as of now. What this refresh interval does is that suppose you have a web application in which you want to have real-time data from the backend. So typically you might have been using WebSockets, but with this library you are not required to use WebSockets if WebSocket is an overkill for your application. So what you can do, you can simply pass in refresh interval 1000, and then in an interval of 1 second, that is, in an interval of 1000 milliseconds, this library would again and again fetch data from this URL. And we would be seeing that in a moment as soon as I save this application. So let me save this application. So we see that we are making network requests at every 1 second here. We see that after every 1 second, we are making a request to this URL endpoint. So this is one of the things which sometimes I use in my application, though I prefer to use WebSockets, but sometimes WebSockets is an overkill. So then you can simply use this refresh interval parameter here, or an option here. So let me comment it out. And now here what I'm going to do, I'm going to create one more component here, which would simply fetch us the a user by ID thing here. That is, currently we are fetching an array of users. We are simply going to fetch user with an ID. But before doing that, what I'll do, instead of simply stringifying it here like this, what I would do, I would simply map this data into some paragraphs here, so that we can only see the name here on individual items here, so that I have more space to work with. So what I'll do, I'll simply say data dot map, and here we have a user, and here we simply want to return a p tag, that is a paragraph. So p, and here I simply want to output the user dot name thing here, and this should have a key. And if you do not know how to work with React.js list, then you can watch my video that is linked above. That is a beginner's course for React.js, and here I can simply provide an user.id like this, and now we would be seeing only the username here inside the list here, as we can see here. So now what I'll do, I'll simply create one more component here, or before making a component here, let me show you one more thing, and that is the mutate function, which is returned from this use SWR hook. So to handle that thing, what I'll do, I'll simply create a button here. So button like this, and let's simply call it refetch data. Refetch data for some reason. It's a dummy button, so I'm simply calling this button like this, that is refetch data for some reason. So we have this button here which currently does nothing, and let me clear out the console. So now this use SWR hook returns us a couple of more objects apart from this data and this error thing. And one more thing that is returned here is the mutate function. So it should be like this, error comma mutate like this. And now what this mutate does is this, that it simply refetches the data from this URL endpoint programmatically. Because currently there was no way to revalidate the data programmatically. Either you need to pass that as an options here with a refresh interval, but to refresh the data programmatically, what you can do, you can use this mutate function. And this mutate function that is returned by this use SWR hook is bound to this URL. So whenever you would call this mutate function, it would simply make a call again to this URL. So here, let me simply handle this button click here. So I can say on click equal to an arrow function, and it simply calls that function, that is mutate. And again, this mutate is bound to this URL here, that is to this exact hook here. And it would simply use the same URL and the same fetcher function here, and the same options as well. Though you can manually change the options here, that is by passing in the options object here, but I'm not going into that details because that is some advanced stuff. But here, let me simply do it like this. So let's save this and watch what would happen as soon as I would click this button here. So we see that currently our this network log is empty. So as soon as I press this button, we see that we are having this thing here, that is we are making a request here. So let me clear out once again. So let me click this. We see that we are making a call to this user's endpoint here. We see that we are making calls to this user endpoint. So let me click it again and again. We see that we are again and again making a call to this user's endpoint to get or refetch the data from this endpoint. So this mutate might be useful for you if you were having some data here and you made a post request using any library like Axios or Fetch to update the data on the backend, and then you want to revalidate the data on the front end with the new data that is present on the backend. Then after making a post request, you can simply call this mutate function to refresh the data from that backend. So this is again what you can do. And now let's have a look at another thing. So let me comment this mutate out from here. And now let's have a look that how do we conditionally fetch data from this endpoint or from any endpoint. So for that, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new component here, and that would be the user component. Currently we have the users component, and now we would be having a user component, or let me call it individual user because it would be like more intuitive. So individual user.jsx like this. And now I'll create a functional component as before, and I would again import the use SWR hook. So I would say import from SWR, I want to import the use SWR thing like this. And now what I want to do is this, that I need to pass some kind of an ID as a prop to this individual user component, and then I want to fetch data for that particular user. Because if we have a look here to this placeholder API, if we simply pass in /1 to this URL endpoint, then we would be fetching data for this particular individual user. So let's do that. So let me grab the URL here, that is this URL, or let me simply copy this everything from here because we only need to make some minor adjustments here. So let's copy that and let's paste it here. And here we see that as soon as we are inside this we are using this SWR hook inside this separate component, we see that we need to have the fetcher function here as well. So what we can do, we can simply create this fetcher function inside its own file somewhere inside our application, and then we can export that fetcher function as a constant which to be used inside any of the components. So for simplicity, let me simply export it as a constant from this file itself, that is from user component.jsx itself, though it should be in its own file. So now I can import this fetcher from that user component.jsx. So let me import it. So now we have this fetcher function, and now we do not need mutate here. We only want to have the data here, and the endpoint would be this endpoint / it should be in backticks because I need to change this. I need to change it to a template string. And here I need to pass in some kind of an ID here, that is the user ID, and this user ID comes as a prop to this component here like this. And then what we can do, we can again make a if checks here, that is if error. If there is an error, we can simply return p with an error message. So we can say error dot message like this. If there is not data, that is if the data is if the network request is in progress, then we can simply return here loading. So we can simply say p loading like this. Otherwise we can simply return the data here, and in the data we can again use the pre tags to return the data here. So let me simply call it pre, and here we would be simply saying just json.stringify data comma null comma 2 like this. So let's save this. And now let me close this network tab here so that we have some more space here. So now let's go to our user component, and here what we want to have is this, that whenever someone clicks on this on these items, that is these names, we should be seeing that data inside this inside this individual user component. So what we can do, we can simply import this new individual user component inside our user component. So we can say individual user like this, and now this individual user has been imported here from the individual user, and here we need to pass in some kind of an ID here because that is the ID or the prop which this component expects. And to store this ID, what I'll do, I'll simply create a state variable inside my user component.jsx. So let me create a state variable here at the very top. So let's say user state, and the state would be the ID of the user ID, and the initial state would be null. That is, there is no user ID. And we also need to import the user state from React. So we can do that. So we have this user state from React. So the initial ID is null here. So we can pass that ID here like this. And now whenever someone clicks on this name here, we want to set the ID according to the user ID here. So what we can do, we can simply handle the onClick listener on this p tag, that is onClick. We can do it like this. We can simply say set ID to be user.id like this. So if I can give me some more room here, we can say that we can see that we have this onClick event on this name thing here. So now this ID is passed here, but let's go back to our individual user component. And now here we see that we are passing in this ID here, and we see that we are getting back an error of request quote failed with 404. And to make it like more explicit, what we can do, we can wrap this thing inside its own div, and we can give it some styling here so that it is like more prominent that what the individual user component is. And let's give it a background color of so background color to be like, let's say light gray or light gray like this. So you can see that. Let's also give it a padding of something. So padding would be, let's say 16 pixels. So we see that we have this. Oh, I click this name here, so we are getting the results here. So let me refresh the page and we'll get back to it again. So we see that we are getting this message here, that is request failed with status code 404, and that is because initially the user ID is null here, and we are making a request here to this URL endpoint, that is /users/null, and which does not exist. So even if we go to this JSON placeholder API, and instead of 1, if we simply pass in null here, we see that we simply get back an empty object here, but this is a 404 error, and this might be validated here as well. So network request, so let's reload. We see that we are getting back a 404 error here from this endpoint, that is users null is a 404 error, and that's what we are seeing inside our application, that we are getting this error. So what do we want to have here is this, that we want to conditionally fetch data depending on this ID, that is whether if this ID is present, then only fetch the data from this endpoint. So to do that, what we can do, we can simply make an if check here, that is using the ternary operator, of course, that is if there is an ID property or the ID prop present, if it is not null, then make a request, otherwise simply pass in null as the key here. So now what would happen is this, that we won't be even making a request to this endpoint with the null value if this ID property is not present. And instead it would only make a request whenever this ID property exists, and then only it would make a request to this URL endpoint. So let's save this. So now we see that we are getting loading here, and that is because this ID is null, this request is not made, we do not have the error, neither do we have the data. So therefore we are displaying loading here. So you can write some more if checks to display data accordingly, but I'm not going into that detail. But here I would like to show you one more thing, that is a request to this URL endpoint is not made by this use SWR hook. So if I right click and click on inspect, and if I go to the network tab again, and if I reload the page, we see that we are not making any request to that endpoint, that is /null, which initially we were doing so. So therefore we were getting the 404 error. But as soon as I clicked here, I clicked on this, I guess I clicked on this second ID here. So therefore we made a request to this 2 here. And if I click on this thing here, we are making a request to this 1. If I click on this thing here, we are making a request to this 5. And if I close this network request, we see that we are getting data as soon as I click on any of the items here or any of the names here. We are making a request and we are getting data. So this is how you use conditional fetching from this use SWR hook. And now one last thing is this, that currently we see that we are using this fetcher function in each and every use SWR hook inside the users component as well. We are making a use of this fetcher inside the individual user also. We are making a use of this fetcher here, but there might be some easier way so that we should not pass to this fetcher function to each and every use SWR hook. So there can be a global place. So let's go to our app.js, and here we have the users component, and inside the users component we have the individual user here. So let's see, here we have the individual user here. So what we can do, we can go to our app.js, and here we can import something else, and that is import something from SWR. And here there is a thing called SWR config like this. And now what we want to do, we want to wrap each and everything which requires that fetcher function or the different options which we can pass inside this SWR hook, which we were passing currently here inside these options directly to this SWR config. So what we can do, we can simply wrap our application inside this SWR config. So SWR config like this, and then we need to wrap this application inside this SWR config. And this SWR config takes in a value prop, and here we need to pass in the fetcher function. So the fetcher would be, it should be like this. So we need to pass in the fetcher function, and the fetcher function is our fetcher function coming from the user component. So let's extract this, or let's cut it out from here, and let's paste it to inside our app.js. And now we do not even need to export it, and you'll get to know why. And let me import Axios here, and now we can simply pass in this fetcher function like this here. And now we are passing this fetcher function here. So what we can do, we can go to our users component, and now we do not need to require, we are not required to pass this fetcher here to this to this hook, because it can directly take that from the SWR provider, that is this SWR config. So we can remove this fetcher function from here. So let's remove it, and let me also remove the options from here. And in the same way, we can go to our individual users here. Again, we do not require the fetcher function because it is a part of that React tree from where that SWR config is providing in the fetcher function. And we can remove this unwanted line from here. And let's save this. Let me remove this as well. And I guess that's pretty much about it. And now if I click on this this thing, we are able to fetch data because we have provided in the global fetcher function for this SWR config. Though if you want, you can override this fetcher function, that is this fetcher function, in any of the components wherever you use this use SWR hook by providing in the second argument, and that is the fetcher function. And that fetcher function can be different from this fetcher function. And similarly, you can provide in some options here. So here, let me simply say refresh interval to be 1 second. So this refresh interval would be the default interval for each and every hook that is a part of this, that is like a child of this SWR config. So this user, so let's go to our network tab, and we would be seeing that we are going to make like multiple requests to this thing here. So we see that we are again and again making requests to this users and this 8 route because we are using the default global refresh interval of 1 second. So guys, that's all about this video. So if you like the video, do hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, do subscribe to the channel. So thank you, bye bye, tata, take care, and have a good day and have a great day.